My name is James Cow. I am Assistant Professor of Art here at Aurora University, and as a member of the Faculty Speaker Series here at Aurora University, it is my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Brandon Kooi received his doctorate from the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University in 2004, and he has been a faculty member here at Aurora University since 2007. Dr. Kooi is an associate professor and former chair of our criminal justice program. His extensive record of publications on all matters criminal justice is matched only by his real-world experience. Dr. Kooi has worked as a private security consultant and executive, a criminal investigator, a law clerk, and a youth crisis interventionist. For the past 10 years, he has worked as a consultant at the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, and much of his discussion tonight will relate to this work, as well as students' projects that seek alternatives to traditional punishment and criminal convictions. Please welcome one of the gentlest souls on our campus, Dr. Brandon Kooi.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I'm not putting on the lapel mic. I think I'm going to be able to project pretty well. My students tell me I'm loud enough, so I'll do that. For those that use LinkedIn, the strangest thing happened to me a couple weeks ago. I started to get all of these congratulations statements on your 9-year anniversary. And it really disturbed me because for a long time I've been telling everybody that I've been here for 6-7 years. I didn't even realize it had been 9 years already, so that time kind of goes fast as an associate professor, as James had said. So tonight's discussion goes into this idea of problem-solving justice. And for those criminal justice students that are in the audience, we've been talking for a while now about the idea that our system is really has a large spotlight on it, and oftentimes in sort of a negative connotation in terms of how we do the job. And this includes the work that I primarily do with policing, but also with court services as well, that people don't really have a lot of faith that our system might be as effective as it should be. One of my kind of more favorite quotes coming from Chief Justice out of Minnesota. I feel like I work for McJustice. We sure aren't good for you, but we are fast. Judges oftentimes complain that they have either a Band-Aid or brain surgery as their solution with nothing in between, right? The Band-Aid would be probation, community service, maybe some kind of restitution, but the recidivism rates remain very high with the offender. Of course, brain surgery would be that we're sending people to the penitentiary, and of course, like people that have brain surgery, they're never the same when they get out, and oftentimes their lives are a lot worse. So possibly there's something in between. So we go into that discussion. Now, as James mentioned, this series, and I think some of you have attended previous discussions as well, is about this celebrating arts and ideas. And another one of my kind of favorite quotes here coming from Eleanor Roosevelt, that small minds discuss people, that if we only focus in on the individual offenders, we might be missing some of our ability to solve problems. Average minds are going to sort of discuss events, where we're going to have great minds discussing ideas. That's the whole intent, I think, of having these series through the university, is that we bring people together and have more open-mindedness in regard to what we might be doing better in the 21st century and what the university might be doing better in terms of producing leaders and really creating these transformative learning experiences for our students so they can go out and do some tremendous things, which we have several of them out there that are doing that, and I'll discuss some of those towards the end of the semester as well. So the first thing that we'll begin to talk about is this idea of what people think when they hear the term criminal justice and maybe where we're at in terms of statistics. Now, if you watch the evening news, which many of us do, of course we're going to have the perception that crime is up and that violence is up and shootings are up and police officers are getting shot more today, post-Ferguson and so forth. And in fact, that all is false, that we find that statistically crime has been going down in virtually all parts of the country for well over 30 years. That this idea of the traditional paramilitaristic approach to doing law enforcement might not be the best effective way to do it, but we oftentimes use these terms like waging war on drugs, waging war on crime, as if that's a war that somehow has a win. in some distant time period, that more police and more prisons are going to produce a reduction in crime, that essentially we can get to this sort of finite number of criminal offenders and eventually crime will begin to plummet. Well, that's really the great American experiment that we've been doing for quite some time, is creating the largest prison population anywhere on the planet. And then this other one, fear-based deterrence, is not very effective. The idea that criminal offenders are really not going to commit crime because they're afraid of getting arrested and going to prison. Truth be told, they commit a whole heck of a lot more crime for the one time that they might get caught. But we might have some faith in targeted deterrence. So again, we'll get into some research that looked at this as well. The reality is this: police are really at a point today, I think, where they're almost a victim of their own success, where we know that crime has sort of plummeted for 30 years, yet the perceptions that the public have for the police have remained somewhat flatlined during that 30 years. So you would suspect that the public would say, my gosh, the police are fantastic, doing a great job for 30 years now, crime has gone down. But of course, that's not what we hear. We hear about perceptions being less about the police doing a good job. People are more concerned about how the police treat them individually than they are in terms of congratulating the police maybe on this 30-year crime decline, which of course is very complex and doesn't just have to do with police. So this is where we're at, and these are some interesting statistics. If you look here in terms of our incarceration rate since the 1980s and our total crime rate, we have had an explosion in the number of people that are incarcerated in this country. We're not talking about some subtle increase here. We're talking about really an explosion. And interestingly, during the same time period, we see total crime rates plummeting. So around the mid-1990s, we see these two numbers sort of converging. Today, we're at about 2.3 million incarcerated, 1% of our total population, again, more than anywhere on the planet. And during this time period, we see crime plummeting. Now, most criminologists will tell you that this is not causality by any means. One's not causing the other. In fact, these incarceration rates have a lot to do with nothing about crime, but have to do with political legislation, oftentimes policies that departments will get involved with, and so forth. So those numbers are a little bit complex to detangle. We know that violent rates of victimization have been going down for quite some time as these prison populations, again, have been accelerating. Just to kind of give you some ballpark numbers here, in 1980, but for me anyway, that's not too long ago, for our students, that's forever ago. In 1980, we had roughly 400,000 people locked up in this country. Again, in the year 2015, we're at 2.3 million. This is a massive increase in terms of our overall prison populations, despite the fact that, again, our criminal offenses, especially violent offenses, have been going down for some time. Interestingly also is that if we look just at firearm violence in this country, we have seen some steady increases. Now, what's interesting about that is if you look at the death from motor vehicles, especially for young people, for the first time in 2015, these two numbers have actually surpassed one another. So today, young people are more likely to be killed by gunfire than they are motor vehicles. So we have seen some slight increases there in terms of firearm violence. That is alarming and concerning, especially in some cities. But mind you that these are dramatically different than what we saw in the early 1990s. That gun deaths in particular is a youth problem, right? So we got ages of 15 and 24. You're much more likely to die of gun violence than anything else. Obviously, as you get older, there's other things that can happen to you in terms of percentage of all deaths. So we're really talking about a demographic change, or a demographic focus here on young males in particular that are faced with that kind of violence. Now, bring us into the modern era. This is taken from the summer of 2015. You can see that we're looking at kind of the first half of 2015 in this particular article, and this became enormously alarming. They said, look, the crime decline is over, right? We're going to see now that increases in overall murders in places like Houston and New Orleans and St. Louis and Milwaukee and Chicago, of course, that we heard a lot about, that there seemed to be a blip on the radar, and young people were killing each other at larger rates. Oftentimes, this was referred to as the Ferguson Effect, if you've heard of this before, right? This was the notion that police officers aren't going to be as vigilant in terms of doing their job because they're now afraid of the public's reaction. And we had, for example, the FBI director that actually made some comments in Director James Comey saying that this is proof that gun violence is up because the cops aren't doing their job as much. And these kind of blips on the radar are there. This is troubling because this idea that criminals are somehow emboldened by the Ferguson effect to become more violent towards the police or violent towards one another is political leverage for a lot of different causes. The reality is, from a criminology standpoint, that we need to begin to look at some of those statistics to see if it was true. Indeed, in some select cities, at the end of 2015, we did see some subtle increases in terms of shootings and in terms of overall murders. Rather, that's going to be a consistent trend in the future. Time will tell. But this idea that the police in particular were being targeted by emboldened criminals was far from the truth. In fact, in the year 2015, this was found to be the safest time period that we kept track of data in terms of police shootings ever. 2013 maybe slightly better as well, but 2015, 2013, very safe. In 2015, the police were 6 times less likely to be shot as compared to the 1970s. You can see during the Prohibition time, it was real dangerous to be a police officer. They were being shot a lot during the Prohibition time. In 2015, we had 38 deaths of police officers by gunfire. Again, one of the lowest that we've ever kept track of. And by the way, this included suicides and also officers shooting officers in an accidental way. So again, when we hear that talk that, police better beware that they're now targets, this isn't always the best message to send because officers will then turn into a different kind of mind frame themselves. So we're looking at, of course, a lot of different issues coming here in terms of the protest, including the case in McDonald with the shooting in Chicago, where the police should lie in terms of these Black Lives Matter. In fact, I'll be doing a May-term class that will be much more focused in on these particular tenuous issues. What I'll bring up just briefly here is the idea that we can do better in policing by not being brought into all of the political discourse. That we're much better as we get away from politics and really determine ways that we can analyze these problems and solve them in more fruitful ways. A good example might be what surgeons had done about 8-9 years ago now. What they essentially did was develop the checklist for pre- and post-op surgeries. In other words, you're not as smart as you think you are with that medical degree, and we should really have a checklist that goes into place so we're not screwing things up. And it turns out when these checklists were developed, there was tons of lives that were saved. There was all kinds of infections that were saved simply because we were willing to not to be seen as experts, but to follow evidence and follow intellectually led evidence-based practices for doing the job a little bit better. We can think about doing the same thing in terms of policing, to let research guide us, to let evidence guide us in terms of how we might solve these problems a little bit better. Here's some of the realities. This is Attorney General out of New Jersey by the name of Ann Milgram, and she used this phrase, Moneyball Justice, which I just loved. If you remember the movie Moneyball, it dealt with the idea of statistics and being able to recruit Major League Baseball players on statistics as opposed to gut feelings. She talks about the idea in the U.S. that we have about 12 million people arrested, and only about 5% of that 12 million are for violent offenses. That about 80% of people that are arrested in this country are for minor misdemeanors. So how do we deal with that from a national level in regards to what we can do to correct that kind of behavior, but not become so penal that we're actually harming their lives in the future? Today we have, again, 2.3 million people locked up. I mentioned this is 1% of our total population, more than anywhere else on the planet, at a cost of $73 billion. I often tell my college students, think about what you're getting getting for grant money right now? What kind of budget is available to you to go to school? And of course, my colleagues in the audience know that this is a tremendous problem in terms of looking at state money and that kind of thing. Well, this is part of the cause, right? If we have the largest prison population in the world, we have to pay for it in some way. If we look at our jail populations here, differentiating between prisons and jails, prisons being that you're serving at a state or a federal penitentiary for a year or more, jails operating at the county level less than a year. What we find is that 2/3 of people that are in our jails today have not been convicted of any crimes. They're still awaiting trial. This is what it means to have a very overburdened system when we can't get to these cases in a very ready way. In addition, 67% of the individuals that go into the court system and through the penitentiary and jail system are going to recidivate. They're going to reoffend in a certain time period. So we're far from being very effective when it comes to that. The notion behind Moneyball Justice, then, is to become much more intellectually led, much more evidence-based led in regards to who's likely to recidivate and who's not. And if we can determine who's less likely, then we could spend maybe less time, resources, and incarceration time, definitely, on their cases. All right. Our U.S. prisons are full. Illinois, one of the worst states in the nation in terms of overcrowding. This is enormously costly. The land of the free, again, incarcerates more people than anywhere else in the world. There's some irony that's involved here, isn't it? When we think about what our nation stands for and essentially what we've done over the last 20 or 30 years. Well, crime has been plummeting. We've been incarcerating more people than anywhere else in the world. What does this look like, right? A picture says 1,000 words, they say. This is pretty overcrowded. I don't know what your living arrangements were like, but I'm guessing that many of us weren't triple bunked, even in some of our crowded homes, right? This is what overcrowded looks like. Now, the issue of race is definitely a major component of how we face a criminal justice system. That indeed crime is frequently concentrated and has always historically been concentrated in very minority neighborhoods. And there tends to be, amongst criminal justice practitioners and probably the community at large, this implicit link to crime being a black problem, right? Because so many arrests are coming out of minority communities. And from a criminology standpoint, there's a causality issue that comes into play. Of course, minorities are involved in neighborhoods where there also is high arrest rates. That doesn't mean one's causing the other. What we also know is there's a lot of other variables in heavily concentrated minorities, such as disadvantage, poverty, single-parent-headed household, and so forth. So there's a lot of causes for these kind of issues. What we also know, from much more of a pragmatic standpoint, is that people of color in minority communities are no more tolerant of that activity than you and I would be. And figuring out ways that we can, in a collaborative way, begin to work with those wider populations to actually make a difference is part of this problem-solving notion that I'll get to here shortly. What also should be explained, or at least understood, is that all of these individuals that are coming from oftentimes these concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods are also being victimized of crimes to an extremely large extent. What we need to understand is that our offenders and victims mirror one another. They're one and the same. These individuals have been victimized as often as they've been offenders. They've lived miserable lives. And we need to figure out ways that we can intervene and create community in those kind of environments so that we don't have to continue on some of the pathways that we're doing with the large incarceration populations. Okay, so how do we do this? I'm going to give you an example, several examples from my own work. And one of the most intimidating things that I ever did, this is a little bit intimidating, but not nearly as intimidating as this. I got to teach on a couple different occasions at the Chicago Police Academy. You talk about a tough audience. You guys are great, right? Chicago police officers hearing an academic talk to them about crime. Let me tell you what you don't tell them. You don't tell them that poverty causes crime, or unemployment causes crime, or single-parent-headed household causes crime, right? Why don't you? Pretty obvious, right? What in the hell can they do about it? Right? My mom just got upset because I swore. I apologize. We can't do much about poverty and unemployment. These are large social factors in regards to thinking about what we're going to do about crime. I can't train police officers about these sociological cues to crime, right? I just love the comment here, right? Blaming my upbringing as part of the crime problem. So instead, if we focus in on actually solving problems, we really need to focus in on near causes to crime as opposed to those large distant causes of crime. The near causes is that crime is definitely opportunistic, especially in hotspot areas where people aren't managing those places very effectively. So that we can begin to look at things like motel disorder and bars and bus stops and other locations that might be facilitating crime. And in a collaborative way, try to make some changes. Okay. We'll get to some of that here in a little bit more detail. Here's part of the problem. We have created in America policing organizations that are structured in ways that make it extremely difficult for the police officers to solve problems. These departments are oftentimes built around a quasi-militaristic model that we believe makes them more professional, but oftentimes trips them up. We use the term noble cause corruption a lot in policing literature, or test-align as police like to call it. When police hear things like Miranda or Matt v. Ohio, which allowed for the exclusionary rule for evidence, these aren't things that they necessarily want to say is a good thing. Mostly they're going to see this as tripping them up, making their jobs a little bit more difficult. Look, I'm just trying to go out and arrest bad guys, and everybody should appreciate that. Every cop needs to learn how to explain and apologize. And if you talk to any police officer, they're going to say, police don't apologize. We don't ever apologize for anything. Yet we know that that could be one of the best things that they can do in terms of explaining to the citizens what they're doing, the role that they're taking on, and trying to do so in a collaborative way. The idea of noble cause corruption says, if the way that I go about doing my job leads to an arrest of a bad guy, who cares how I got there? It's okay. In other words, the ends justify the means. Now, obviously, in a democratic nation, this can cause a lot of problems if we're violating rights and violating the Constitution, and we don't want officers buying into that notion of noble cause corruption. The other part of the subculture of policing that is predominant oftentimes is this notion of blue wall of silence. And we've been hearing a lot about this in Chicago, for example. If you're familiar and followed that McDonald's shooting, it was horrendous. When we saw the video, we thought, boy, that cop really messed up. And what is even worse is that, of course, several months went by before the video was released to the public. In other words, there seems to be this ongoing blue wall of silence where we don't want to be very accountable and reluctant to kind of tell on one another. Now, from the public's vantage point, they should just say, well, the police should, if something goes wrong and somebody's unethical, they should tell on them. Let me tell you, that's difficult to do. What other profession runs around telling each other, go and tell on one another? Do we say that to lawyers? Do we say it to doctors? Do we say it to academics? That's something that we don't normally tell professionals. Why should the police really be any different in terms of trying to get them to do it? Oftentimes we hear about police officers going native. In other words, that they're going to buy into that subculture that says we protect each other. We watch each other's backs. We're not going to testify against one another. And that's important to understand. Here's another solution to this kind of issue, recognizing that those challenges are immense in terms of the police subculture. We need to pay attention to the way that we train officers in terms of the police academy training and in terms of in-service training and so forth. Put yourself in the shoes of being a police officer. You go through the police academy. Everything that you basically learn in the police academy, I say everything, but a big percentage of it is negative, right? It's all kind of negative. We're trained not to misuse force, especially today. Don't take bribes. Don't lie. Don't use chokeholds. Don't kill people. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, right? And it turns out those militaristic policies are oftentimes based upon SOP manuals that are also very negative in nature. We don't spend enough time teaching officers to actually solve problems on their job, to collaboratively work with the community, unless they're able to get with some really good leadership within good progressive police departments. Something as simple, and I just found this kind of fascinating, in looking at Branton's work in New York City the first time around as a police commissioner, they began to look at data of New York City police officers who were doing chokeholds on suspects who ended up dying of asphyxiation. And a simple sort of step back here and say, okay, what's causing some of this? And what they found was that the officers were being trained, of course, that when somebody's being combative, to take them to the ground, put a knee to the head or to the back, provide some pressure as far as a chokehold so that they can get handcuffed. Now, what the officers would frequently begin to report is that the individuals began to fight a lot when they took them down to the ground and they're putting a chokehold and trying to say, stop, 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 we need to handcuff you. Now, if you think about it for a moment, if you can't breathe and somebody has their, something around your neck, are you going to fight? And is that fight going to become even more progressive? Right? So what they began to do was train officers to try to allow the person to be at least seated in some point. In other words, get them up and then try to handcuff them. And they found that there was a decline in people dying of asphyxiation. Not because we want the officers to be injured by any means, but that we want the officers to at least do the job so that they don't end up having a fatality on them. This is good information for the officers as well. They don't want to kill people when they're out on the streets. So we need to figure out ways to do that kind of work a little bit better. All right. So how can we do this? This is kind of the Aurora side of the story, I guess, and some of my own research as well. One is just the idea of being proactive as opposed to reactive. And a lot of this work is done through this critical thinking model known as the SARA process, where we often teach students about that kind of process, where we're going to, and we do a lot of training with police agencies as well. What we want the departments to do is to look at past responses that they've done for a variety of different problems in the community and determine if those responses have created more fear or they've gained more trust within the community. The response might have meant that bad guys were incarcerated, right? And we would assume that that's a good thing. But not if the community is left with more fear because of the response that was chosen. So there's times, in other words, where the police can be acting very lawfully, but it's considered to be awful by the community that they're serving. So the notion behind this model is to reanalyze, come up with better collaborative responses that might include the community as a whole. Interestingly, it covers a lot of this medical model that's been around for a while that says that we really need to focus in on primary prevention before we focus in on tertiary prevention. If you think about, for example, cures for cancer, we're much better off by having large public campaigns that tell people stop smoking, exercise, lose weight. All of these things are going to help us, of course, in regards to preventing certain diseases and cancers. Same thing could be said for public campaigns to prevent people from being victimized or to handle offenders before we have to rely on the brain surgery, the arrest and the criminal justice system. Before we have to rely on chemotherapy and radiation, we should provide a lot more resources towards these primary zones. The good thing about Aurora University and offering criminal justice degrees is that there is some evidence that has been gaining that our college students that have college degrees generally get this kind of stuff better. They're out solving problems and being better leaders in policing than perhaps those without a degree. Today, only about 25% of our sworn police officers have a four-year degree. Some will have some college, but about 75% do not. In fact, if you look at the overall training hours that it takes to be a police officer and compared to other professions, it's going to take you a lot longer, it turns out, to hang a shingle, to cut hair in this country than it will to be a sworn police officer. Not to say that the training that they don't do isn't good, but maybe there's other things that we could be thinking about in the 21st century in terms of training police officers. And for quite some time, there's been calls for having better educated officers out in the streets of policing America. So a couple of years ago, we invited a number of police administrators from around the Midwest area to do a meeting essentially here at Aurora University. And one of the things that I floated by them with our chair, David Dial, was that what if we got together sometime in the future and had a statewide problem-oriented policing conference? We would ask departments to come in and just share information and present to one another about problems that they're faced with, initiatives that they've attempted that may or may not have been successful. We don't have to always say that everything works, because of course there's a lot of things that we try in policing that doesn't work, or things that we're still in the midst of analyzing so we can come up with a better response. So last May we brought together the first statewide problem-oriented policing conference. At the international level, they've been doing this for about 25 years, so we're really proud to bring these groups together at the Naperville Marriott. We'll be doing the same in the fall for the second annual Illinois Problem-Oriented Policing Conference. I'll give you some examples of some initiatives that we've done here at the university, and then some of my own personal work too, in terms of this notion of problem-oriented policing, so you can have a better idea what this is. So problem-oriented policing came from a law professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison by the name of Herman Goldstein. One of my first attempts at doing problem-oriented policing, I was kind of share this story about another intimidating process, was to teach problem-oriented policing to a room full of police chiefs from the state of Wisconsin. And I had to talk for a couple hours about essentially problem-oriented policing, situational crime prevention. And lo and behold, who's in the front row? The guy that came up with this stuff is watching me present on it. Extremely intimidating. And I can remember telling Herman at lunch break, I can't believe I'm teaching problem-oriented policing in front of you. Man, I must have really missed the boat here. What did I screw up? And that moment on, he became such a great mentor for me and said he was really excited that I was part of this process and really encouraged me to continue to learn more about his phenomenal work that he put together. Local story here, Herman Goldstein was actually the executive assistant of O.W. Wilson in the Chicago Police Department in the 1960s. He saw a lot, being the main assistant to O.W. Wilson. You can imagine Chicago in the 1960s, that we were doing a lot of processing of cases, but not really measuring if we were impacting crime at all. And the thoughts behind problem-oriented policing really came out of Chicago in the 1960s with O.W. Wilson. So what is it? It's essentially encouraging our police officers at virtually every level of the department to have a voice, to come up with creative responses, to become much more analytical at understanding the causes of the problem before we decide on how to respond to the problem. That we need to essentially throw out conventional wisdom and come up with new ideas based upon a more thorough analysis. And we're going to be very transparent in the way that we do this and accountable to the public. Give you a quick example here. At Michigan State, our graduate students were allowed to map out crime data for the Lansing, Michigan Police Department. First time that the city had ever done this. And we all had sort of our pet projects that we began to initiate based upon our findings of the data. Interestingly for me, I found out that the #1 hotspot for larceny from vehicles, which is theft of items out of vehicles, was where I was living. Right? So a population of about 115,000, #1 hotspot year after year after year for larceny from vehicles was the complex that I was living in, which consisted of about 300 people. That blew my mind. Right? Now, here's 2 questions that came to mind. One, does any cop in Lansing, Michigan know where the #1 hotspot for larceny from vehicles are? Heck, right? The second question is, does anybody living around me know where the #1 hotspot for larceny from vehicles are? Right? Now, again, remember this idea of transparency. This is a buzz term that we use all the time in government. Imagine if they did. What do you think? How quick would this change? Right? Would we point fingers at the police and say, this is your problem to solve? Maybe. A lot of chiefs get afraid of that, right? In terms of sharing data is going to be sort of a blowback on us. Or would the people living in that environment, the would-be victims, begin to protect themselves better? Could we put leaflets out to the entire community and say, lock your stuff up? And maybe challenge some young people as they're roaming the parking lots, looking into cars and causing mischief. So this is a new kind of approach that we begin to share data, we begin to become much more communicative with the community for understanding the problems that they have.
One of my other mentors is David Kennedy, who works at John Jay College in New York City. He and I were doing some things with residential drug dealing, covert drug dealing and overt drug dealing, around the same time period when I was in Wisconsin. And Kennedy talks a lot about high crime communities really lacking community, right? True community. And he talks about the notion that why should we be surprised when we don't really spend time and resources at developing solid communities in high crime areas when kids are pulling the trigger? We're giving them the ammo. Why should we be surprised when they're pulling the trigger, right? And he makes this notion that we really need to pay attention to the social psychology that's involved when young people are standing out on a street corner peddling dope and willing to pull the trigger. For most of us, we can't conceive why anybody would make that choice in life. Why in the world would somebody work the most dangerous occupation that exists in terms of the threat of being in a morgue, the threat of going to prison, or making less money than you would, it turns out, for flipping burgers at McDonald's? Why would anybody make that kind of choice? Now, I might ask, why do I wear a tie today? Right? I'm looking around, saying, not very many anyways, wearing a suit and a tie. Right? So why did I do it? Why did I dress like this? Right? My son's in the audience. My mom's in the audience. They don't normally see me walking around with a shirt and tie if I'm at home. If I didn't wear a tie, my mom might have got upset because she's in graceful etiquette then, right? We need to dress nice. Why did I do it though, right? There's certain social cues and social pressures. In a similar way, do we still have those social cues and social pressures that are placed upon young, oftentimes minorities, to stand on a street corner with a piece in the waistband and dope in their pocket? What causes that? We really need to tap into those kind of social processes. It wasn't very long ago when very rich, established white guys would go out into the woods and hack each other to death. You remember this? Right? This was called dueling. Right? Anybody know who's on a $10 bill? Pull out your one. Who's on a $10 bill?
Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton.
Very good. Right? Are you smarter than an 8th grader? Right? Hamilton was hacked to death during a duel. Right? It was an honor code. Right? You can't not go and do these kind of things if you're white, privileged, established, and somebody challenges you. There's the same thing going on in the streets today. We need to understand what that honor code is, and we need to figure out on how to become extremely targeted, it turns out, at these very small number of offenders that are causing mass amount of problems for the wider community. Now, the interesting thing is that wider community is no more tolerant of that activity than anybody else. But what they're also not tolerant of is the traditional law enforcement approach that has continued year after year after year to arrest a high number of young males, and things haven't gotten better. So we need to be able to determine where the common ground is. David Kennedy's work all throughout the country has done a lot of different things, but part of it is calling them in. Right? What they say is that we need to run a targeted investigation on the small number of people that are causing the problems. If they're not violent yet, if they don't have long felony records yet, and we make solid cases on them, why should we arrest them? Why should we formalize the process through the criminal justice system? Now believe me, trying to tell police chiefs, don't arrest dope dealers who might be carrying weapons and let's do something else, is a big leap of faith, right? Telling prosecutors not to prosecute these cases is an enormous leap of faith. What we essentially do is send them a letter, and we say, look, we want you to come down to meet with the community. You're not going to be arrested. Bring somebody that you love, and let's have a sit down. Now, if you're peddling dope, and you get a letter from the police chief saying, come on in, let's have a chit-chat, you think you're showing up? That's what the researchers were basically told. And surprisingly, many showed up. And those that didn't show up that first night would show up in subsequent nights. And they would be faced with this. They would be faced with prosecutors, oftentimes at the federal and state level, with police detectives, police chiefs, your traditional formal side of social control and government. They would also be faced with members of the community, people that they know and trust, football coaches, people in the clergy, neighborhood leaders, social workers, job providers, education providers, all of these people rallying together to say, look, we screwed this up for the past 10, 15, 20 years by letting the police solve this problem alone. And we put them in a horrible position, by the way. Now we're going to do it right. We're all going to come together with this sort of common ground notion to try to steer you in the right direction. All right, so let me do a little transition here, and I'm actually going to show you one of the films that came out of one of these call-in meetings. This is sort of an internal film. You're not going to find this thing on YouTube, but we'll take a listen to it here.
The reality of this situation is that there's a lot of people's lives that are being ruined because of drug use. And you might be saying in your own defense, well, yeah, but they choose to buy it. And you're right, they choose to buy it. That's right. But you're still selling an illegal substance. It's illegal. What's wrong?
Becky Yates, and I'm with Caring Services. We are transitional housing programs for recovery for addicts. Now call us, and we'll get your victims. And let me tell you, it's not pretty what you're doing to people in our community. You don't tell them when you sell them that crack that their teeth are going to rot out. You don't tell them that they might end up dead. We see them. We see their pain. We feel their pain. You guys need to stop killing people.
There. Apparently they're going to show you the evidence that they have. I don't know. But they're giving you an opportunity to turn your life around. And certainly we are here that if we can assist you in doing that, then that's what we're willing to do, wherever that is. But you have been targeted. And yes, we are tired of it. And yes, if I have to point my finger, I have no problem in doing it.
I assigned a detective for each one of them that were identified, and these cases here represent what these detectives have already done on your behalf. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you this is where it's a little different tonight. We've already bought drugs from most people we call in. Let that sink in with. We've already bought. Most of you could be arrested tonight, but we already told you we don't want to arrest you. That's not why you're here.
Folks, I'm Stuart Albright. I'm a Guilford County District Attorney, and I'm Guilford County. I'm not Greensboro. I'm not High Point. I got 28 assistants, some of them in the Greensboro courthouse, some of them in the High Point courthouse. I'm not here tonight to try and scare you. I don't need any more cases. I got all I can say grace over right now. And I can promise you, with the 7,000 felonies and over 100,000 misdemeanors we've prosecuted in Guilford County, I can't remember every single name. But I can remember y'all's name. I got every one of y'all on the list, all 10, 11 of y'all here, and every one of my assistants has your name. And if they don't prosecute you, if you show up in their courtroom, show back up in the system, and they don't prosecute you as aggressively as they can, I'll fire them. Okay? Their job's on the line. You got to know that.
I'm Rob Lane, Assistant United States Attorney. I work for the United States Attorney Ambrose Wagner. But with you, we felt we could give you an opportunity to come in here. And I want you to remember, what did the major tell you, the family members? We have made buys from you now. You're done, if we choose so. Do you know how powerful that is for the police department to hold the charge? Do you know what it takes? How deeply they believe that there's redeemable value in each and one of you courts you over there in the West End area is ready. They're waiting. They're ready to help you make the change. The community is ready to help you make the change. And I will tell you, if you don't take that option, we're going to make the change for you, and you will find your fate in prison. We believe very strongly in prison ministry.
You need to be concerned about your families, because when you go to jail, your families are still left back here.
The revolving door is closed, guys. You test us, you lose.
All right, so, whoops, sorry. Some tough talk there. I had a couple students say, you know, man, they're really shaming them
in this process. The results of this has been pretty promising in many communities. Again, politics will get in the way in terms of how these call-in meetings are initiated. Several communities reporting that their hotspot drug activity literally disappeared overnight. That some really good assessment being done showing that drops in violent crime and drug crimes to significant levels within the targeted neighborhoods where these kind of initiatives took place. These things take months of planning. Oftentimes communities will jump in thinking, oh, we'll just call them in and let's grab some people and see if this works. This is a really concerted effort that takes months in planning. One of the things that is somewhat frustrating for the police and the public at large is that problem-oriented policing does take a while because of the analysis and because of the very targeted kind of response. Another example that I'll show you just a quick video on was work that I was doing in Sheboygan, Wisconsin that was called Neighbors Against Drugs. Again, months of planning that took place before this process went into play. This is the very quick version of it, but essentially what we found was that there was a lot of crack cocaine being dealt in the city of Sheboygan. There were targeted neighborhoods that there was substantial evidence that there was dope dealing coming out of some of the houses and apartment complexes. Rather than having MEG units and undercover operations doing controlled buys all over the city, they allowed for some of the community police, this is the chief here, some of the community policing initiatives to begin to target the issue. What we did was a multitude of responses. One was that landlords would do a better job being trained by the police to do crime-free housing and to write up leases so that if the property was being used for criminal activity, we could essentially tear up the lease. What the volunteers also did was purchase big red signs that said Neighbors Against Drugs, you kind of see it there. And they placed these signs within a targeted block where everybody would get a sign in their front yard with one exception. Who do you think wouldn't get the sign? Right, the dealer, right? Now, you laugh, you know, when people first kind of thought about this idea, that's not going to work. You'd be surprised, right? Big spotlight, big, you know, community outreach saying we're in this together and we're pointing our finger at that property. Not necessarily any offender, but at that property. There's things going on at this property that's causing a lot of problems. And we began a very large media campaign as well to re-educate the community that the cops aren't going to be able to solve this problem together. We need to stop policing for the community and police with the community, and they're really going to be the ones that are able to create some kind of change in long-term, sustainable ways. So I'll show you a quick video of kind of what this is.
But it never thought he'd see this in his Sheboygan neighborhood.
Yeah, it's real nice. The kids are outside playing in the front and everything. For a while, the kids when you come into the front though.
Kids didn't play outside on South 13th Street, not because they didn't want to, but because it wasn't safe.
We hear a lot of vandalism done here with cars getting broken in, windows smashing, and a lot of trafficking down here at different houses in and out at all the times at night.
The neighborhood was infested with drugs. It was so bad, Denise Godeman was close to moving out.
I just wanted to get into a different neighborhood.
But instead, a group called Neighbors Against Drugs, or NAD, came to the rescue.
This program is all about empowering neighborhoods to rid of the neighborhood drug dealing.
Todd Prevey is a Sheboygan community police officer and heads up NAD.
This is not something that law enforcement has done before.
He says the drug dealers are now gone after NAD showed this neighborhood how to push the dealers out by putting the pressure on landlords to evict them.
We're not talking about arrests, we're talking about dealers losing their home.
And it isn't just this neighborhood that's benefited from Neighborhood Against Drugs. In fact, over the last 2 years, the program has helped 17 neighborhoods get rid.
So what we saw was the initiative beginning to take off. A lot of different neighborhoods and communities wanting that kind of outreach. We did some analysis of the crime data, very significant drops in things that surround the drug market, such as disorderly conduct, people urinating on lawns, cars getting broken into, the noises that go on in the drug market during certain times of the night. And ultimately somebody saying, I would have sold my house had it not been for this kind of initiative, did well. The project was presented at the International Problem-Oriented Policing Conference like Aurora a couple years ago, which I'll show you here shortly. It was acknowledged as one of the better projects throughout the world in terms of thinking about problem-oriented policing. A little side note here, Todd Prevey went from being a patrol officer to be elected as sheriff of Sheboygan County. So this kind of stuff does carry some weight in terms of just people's careers when they can become sort of signified with these kind of initiatives. And he's still the sheriff of Sheboygan County as well. You don't normally see patrol officers going to be sheriff. Another example of this, we had a graduate student here at Aurora University getting a graduate degree in criminal justice, who was also working with Joe McMahon on something called the Second Chance Initiative that's been around for a long time in terms of Kane County courts. Real interesting approach here from the notion of problem-oriented courts. Community panels, volunteers would come in to interview first-time offenders and determine if their prosecution should be deferred. So you see a lot of interesting work that could be done with the community having some say-so in making decisions. About 95% of the applicants that meet with that community panel will be told to, the prosecutor will be told to defer that prosecution. Essentially what that means is that we're not going to charge you yet. Don't screw up. Pay your fines. Don't get rearrested and so forth. When we finally were able to do an assessment of a random number of individuals over about a 10-year time period, we determined that 92% of those that were successful at not getting rearrested during the year that they were in deferred prosecution also did not recidivate for over 3 years. These rates are a lot better than individuals that are being punished through probation or otherwise catching some kind of conviction. So there seems to be a lot of support and obviously enormous cost savings for thinking about deferred prosecution, even for felony type offenses, as opposed to always looking for convictions. This was a group of students that presented just last semester in a policing class where they worked with the Oswego Police Department on domestic violence and analyzing some of their data and information in regards to thinking about ways that we can problem solve. So there's a lot of different initiatives throughout the university and our criminal justice program to bring practitioners together with our students to help along that problem-solving process. And they provide us with a lot of good advice and good inside knowledge in regards to where we might be headed. Real briefly, I'm going to talk about the Aurora Initiative and then introduce a guest that I asked to come this evening, and that's the new Aurora Police Chief, Kristen Zeman. So we'll get to that here shortly. Aurora did fabulous work over the last 10 or 15 years. For those that might be more familiar, if you grew up in Aurora, the early 2000s, the late 1990s, the city was much more violent than what we see today. What we find is that the goals, and this was another project that was recognized by the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing as doing a really good job when it came to gun violence, was that it's one of the few programs and initiatives where you can see police agencies being enormously comprehensive when it comes to these three main components of reducing gun violence in youth gangs. That being suppression towards the gang leadership, but also working towards intervention and at the same time, over long periods of time, working for community prevention as a whole. Now, what also is important to note is that there was a lot of initiatives that were attempted in the past, and what many communities do where there's not very good effectiveness. So we have to admit when things aren't working. One of the classic examples that any student that ever had me in intro will talk about is DARE. Right? And for the older people in the audience, we remember this. Drug abuse resistance education. We like the Frisbees, we like the bumper sticker, my kid's a DARE graduate, and yay, 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 you're teaching your kids well. But the students know, of course, the research shows that there's no evidence that DARE is effective and works. In fact, there were some studies actually indicating that the DARE graduates might be using more dope than the kids that didn't get DARE, right? So we got some problems, it turns out, with some of the idea and assumptions that we carry that things work when in fact they might not work. Something like zero tolerance arrest, right? We know that you belong to a gang, so when we see you out on the street, we're going to question, we're going to frisk you, we're going to be very aggressive at going after you. Gun recoveries, gun buybacks. I remember Chief Thomas saying, and probably several officers, the Latin Kings aren't lining up to sell you your guns, right? We're not getting guns off of the people that we need to get guns off of. Finding cooperative witnesses can be a problem when people are not really trustworthy of the system, per se, in regards to how we're going to handle murders and shootings. Another one that, ironically, David Kennedy did some work in here was the idea of Ceasefire, that we would take former gang members to work with current gang members and say essentially, hey, I used to do what you're doing, put down your guns, there's a better life for you. What we need to, again, look at is the social processes that are involved when it comes to some of this gang violence, right? We know that there is no dumber organism on the planet than a young man with his friends watching, right? The social processes are immense, it turns out, in regards to encouraging people to do fantastically stupid stuff. And unless we're willing and able and provide the adequate resources to begin to intervene into that social process, no number of arrests are going to help cure that problem. Okay? So the idea behind Typhoid Mary, if you're familiar with the term here, was that this was a woman that had spread a disease that at the time was not curable to a number of individuals. We were looking at the gang leadership as doing the same. That they were so powerful in the dialogue and the rhetoric that was going on in the streets that they were essentially spreading the disease, and we needed to figure out a way to intervene. One of those ways, of course, is to arrest those leaders, determine who they are, make solid cases against them, use the federal government, and it turns out there were some great initiatives that began to do that. But we had to have these other things occurring, and there's all kinds of research that indicates community relations and so forth is going to be able to do some of this. So a lot of different cases come out of the suppression arena. We have a lot of cold cases being filed. We have first-degree burn and so forth. The real traditional side of law enforcement, fantastic work that they did with multiple different agencies. The other part of this was to really begin to look at how graffiti and the social cues and the physical attributes of crime are causing some of the issues, moving towards crime-free housing, and really becoming numbers-focused, right? One of the more fantastic things that I saw the Aurora Police Department doing was using some of those Covey principles and being very goal-orientated. Let's see the numbers. What kind of goals do we have set year to year, and are we achieving those goals? And to become very transparent in terms of some of those numbers. Prevention, as far as a community collaborative notion, became enormously important. At East Aurora, we find that they have one of the largest junior LTC programs in the nation. Boys to Men did some phenomenal work here at Aurora University. Our My Time, Triple Threat Mentoring, all of these different groups are somewhat new to the community, but also enormously impactful at convincing that next generation to do something better with their lives. So the statistics are somewhat revealing in terms of just looking at shootings between 2003 and 2007. 156 shootings in 2008, 2012, 79 shootings the last time this was presented. So you're talking about shootings being cut in half over a 5-year time period. In terms of homicides, what you're looking at is between 2003 and 2007, essentially our trend line here, you got a murder a month. We're averaging about 12 murders in a given year during this 5-year time period. Between 2008 and 2012, it's about 2.6 murders in a given year annually, 2012 being 0. By the way, you had places like Rockford in 2012 that had 11 homicides, Peoria that had 10, Chicago, of course, having 500 plus, and the city of Aurora, first time since 1946, I believe, having 0 murders. So that was something that people began to look at as being a big deal, but we also needed to look at the trend lines in terms of was this real. So this was presented in Dayton, Ohio. We brought one of our Aurora students with as well, Clayton Mohammed from Boys to Men, and we're able to discuss this with international audiences. And that's what's somewhat phenomenal about talking to people from Australia and Ireland and England about this kind of work and then really learning from the overall experience. The whole point of this is that we want to continue to have a larger community prevent the next generation from occurring. All right. So flashback here, right? We have, of course, the spotlight that is on the system, thinking about ways that we're going to be able to do this better. The challenges are immense in terms of Ferguson and Chicago and McCarthy resigning from his position. There is indeed, for those that want to go into policing and our criminal justice students, a spotlight on this. My take on it is that we need to do a much better job at solving problems as opposed to simply reacting to crime. That too often we find that our police officers are really psychologically isolated if they're spending so much time in their cruisers and waiting for those calls for service and not being involved with larger community type initiatives. We need to work in a way that really begins to address the root causes for many problems as opposed to simply chasing our calls and responding to those calls. Clearly that's easier said than done. And oftentimes it's the leadership that matters the most within policing and the organizational context that many of these departments work in to meet some of those challenges. Okay? So with that, I am going to introduce you to somebody who has a much larger task at accomplishing that than I do, because Chief Kristen Zeman is now in charge of the Aurora Police Department. I will tell you that she is an Aurora University alum, which is the very big part of this in terms of 2003. I'll also tell you that Kristen has her master's degree from Boston University in criminal justice organizational leadership. She was a graduate from Northwestern University, executive leadership. She gets around when it comes to these universities. Harvard Kennedy School of Government, senior executive training, Senior Management Institute of Police. She's also the former president of the National Association for Women Law Enforcement Executives, and she's earning her next master's degree. I don't think you have it quite done yet, but soon, from the U.S. Post-Naval Post-Grad School, where she's going to be earning a master's degree in Homeland Security and Defense. So our newly minted Aurora Police Chief, give me a round of applause for Thank you. And then we'll take questions from the audience as well. So thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Kooi. I wasn't expecting a reporter to tackle me when I walked in the door, so thanks for that. I appreciate you having me. Boy, you talk fast. Do you do that in all of your classes?
I do.
How do you guys take notes? So is it possible for you to go back to that screen where you were hating on the police?
Which one?
The one about militarization?
Yeah.
Because I had so many, I was actually jotting down thoughts, and then I thought everything that you have in that slide kind of encompasses what I want to talk about as far as our police department and policing in general. So this quasi-militaristic approach that we have to policing is very interesting because it's been the way policing has been for a very long time. Interestingly enough, though, it started out with Sir Robert Peel's principles of the community are the police and the police are the community. And somewhere over time we've evolved into this paramilitaristic idea of policing. So I absolutely want to address this because I think that the one thing where we have to begin is with the end in mind, and with that, recruitment. Who are we recruiting? And you can look at recruitments for different police departments, and that's why you'll find policing in different communities different across the nation, because it starts in the community and in that police department. So who are we recruiting? So you can look at, there's a video out there of recruitment. I can't remember the police department, it escapes me right now, where they flash on the screen, you've got officers in all cami, they've got their machine guns, they're jumping fences, they're chasing people, and it's, do you want to be a part of the biggest, baddest gang, known to man? And then fast forward to another police agency that has police officers talking to other humans in the neighborhood, and do you want to be a part of this collaborative effort with our community? Is this the team that you want? So who are you attracting? So in certain police departments, you have to be very careful about what personalities you're attracting. So this is where I believe it actually begins. So not only then are we attracting, police, I would say, attract people of action. We are people that are running towards the gunfire. We are people that are running towards things that other people are running away from. So that's sort of the adrenaline junkies that are attracting, but you have to have good purpose with that action. And so that's part of it. Recruitment is where we begin and who we're looking at to join this force. Then you go into the academies. So in the academies, and I'm a product of of PTI, the Police Training Institute at the University of Illinois, and very paramilitaristic there as well. In fact, so paramilitaristic that people are yelling in your face, and they're getting you used to what that feels like, is to have someone encroach on your personal space. They're also teaching you, to keep your hands up here by your face. So when you talk to people, and you'll see a lot of police officers that are still, they have their hands maybe tucked into their vest, they have their hands up here. That's just quickly so we can do that. And we're trained, and I'm not kidding, in the academy, when you dropped your hands, you got popped in the chest. So this is what we're dealing with. Now, but the part I want to focus on is specifically is how you talk to people. See, we can teach all of those things, like defensive tactics, and I can teach you how to take a gun into a range and shoot at targets. I can teach you all of that, right? That's easy, but what I think is very difficult to teach is how to communicate with another human being, how to look at people instead of down on them. And that is the one thing that we are lacking I believe, in our academies. I think there has to be a complete overhaul in how we train our police officers, because it sets us up, our police training, I believe, in my humble opine, that it sets us up for that us versus them mentality right when we walk out of that academy. So we're always looking, we're at our guard when we talk to people, we're standing here, somebody's gonna punch me in the face, instead of learning how to ask someone, what's your plight? Talk to me. And have a conversation with people. And I'm ashamed to say that up until this point, we don't even have one-on-one verbal interviews with our candidates. They go through the testing process, and we bring them in and how they've scored on the test. They get preference points for having a degree. That's a whole other topic I would love to debate, because I debate it all the time with a lot of people at work. But we have recruits coming out of the program, but we've never even sat down and had a conversation with them to determine whether or not they can talk, they can communicate. And this is one of the main problems that we have in policing, is that we're afforded the tools given to us by the law. The United States Constitution allows us to incarcerate, allows us to place people under arrest, allows us to search, allows us to do that very thing that you said, the land of the free. I like that, is to take away a person's freedom. And so we have all these tools at our disposal as long as we're in alignment with the Constitution. But what we fail to use before going to those other tools of use of force is our influence, is to be able to talk to people. And you mentioned respect, about earning respect. And this is a debate I also get into police officers. Well, you know what? If someone disrespects me, I'm going to disrespect them right back. We have this notion that respect is something that has to be earned, right? How many times have you heard that? You earn my respect. You have to earn that. What if we changed our paradigm ever so slightly and we just gave away respect freely without having to earn it? So in my estimation, and I can't emphasize enough about looking at people instead of looking down on them. That's where respect comes from. So what if we had this notion that instead of, this is where a lot of police interactions go wrong, is when somebody comes with their chest puffed up, and then that police officer is not going to back down. But what if we just tried to engage in a conversation? And there's nothing soft about that, by the way. You'll talk to some traditional, maybe old school minded police officers that are like, I'm not backing down. If somebody doesn't listen to me, then it's on. And I think for me, I come at it from a different perspective, because, well, look at me. I don't have the stature to be able to go hands on with someone and win. So as a 5'4", 125-pound police officer coming up through in now my 22 years, I have had to talk people into handcuffs. And so I have not been able to, afford, because I'd get my butt kicked. But I recognize that, so I've had to learn the skills of influence. And again, there's nothing soft about that. I think some of the best police officers are even some of the biggest police officers that look at people and that use their personal influence. So I have so much to say, and I mean, I don't even know where to begin, because you hit on so many topics, I literally stopped taking notes. But also, this noble cause corruption is real. There is this notion that the ends do justify the means, is that if I'm putting a bad guy in jail, does it matter if, I fudge a little bit on the evidence? Yes, the answer is absolutely. It absolutely matters, because that is that Constitution that we have to be in alignment with. And you're right, there's so many police officers that look at that at the Constitution as a barrier to getting this done. And that's a problem. I will say, though, it is less of a problem in Aurora, Illinois, and here is why. Because we have started, and it's been my predecessors. I've been at this job for 2 weeks, so I get no credit. But because of the predecessors and the professionalism that we have built, it starts with tolerance. So what you tolerate is what you accept. You can have all the standard operating procedures in the world. You can have general orders that say, you will not use excessive force. But then you get on the street and you've got supervisors that turn a blind eye to it, or peers that do the same thing. So, or even hey, I saw you give that guy what for, and a high five in the locker room. That is the informal culture. And when you don't allow that to fester in your organization, then you won't have problems like that. And I am proud to say that in our organization, it is not tolerated. I can give you an example of we fired a police officer, not for committing any acts of excessive force, but we have him on video watching as another police officer slammed a handcuffed person's head into the hood of the car. That police officer was not fired, the one that actually committed the actual use of force, because he said he did it and he was suspended for a very long period of time. But the officer who sat there and watched him do it, that in an interview said, I didn't see anything, we fired him. So we don't tolerate that atmosphere of that thin blue line. The thin blue line has a very negative connotation, is that we protect each other at all costs, right? Actually, it's taken on that negative connotation, but the thin blue line is actually something very noble, and it, to me, the message that I'll be sending in my police department is that it means that we police ourselves, and who will guard the guardians? Well, we will, absolutely, and so we have no tolerance for that. So that starts in the organization, and I think you'll see very professional organizations across the nation, you'll find that it starts at the top level. You'll look at other organizations just in recent months of, in Chicago, and I hate to throw Chicago under the bus, but those officers, stood there and then said they didn't see anything, and it's just not, it's what you tolerate is what exists. So I think I touched it, but I loved this slide because there were so many things I was jotting down. So I'll shut up if you guys have any questions for me, because I could go on forever. And can I have this?
Yeah, absolutely. That was there for you. Yeah, thank you,
All right,
Kristen.
anybody have anything for me?
Yeah. Any questions at all? We'll open it up to both, and we'll throw out any responses that come to our minds, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the budget crisis that Illinois is in, you are going to start to see, probably, or you've already seen, cuts within mental health services for individuals. With those cuts come, where do they go? Most likely the streets, or half or a percentage. Is there training for police officers to handle that? How, as a police department, will you handle that?
Sure. So you're right. We have what's called the crisis intervention team. And so this team is comprised of officers who have gone through 40 hours of training for mental health issues. And I want to say right now, the last time I looked at the stats was about in November, not the stats, but the number of people. We have 25 officers that have been through this. Now, that's a small percentage in a department of 289 sworn. However, it's a really good start. So what these CIT officers do is what we recognize when we have mental health issues. And the mental health issues are those, our hands are always tied because, and if you sound like you're probably very well versed in the mental health community, but we have this barrier, and that we can't do anything unless they are a danger to themselves or to someone else. Well, by the time they've endangered themselves or someone else, it's too late, so we have to look at these warning signs. And so a lot of the warning signs that we see as first responders, where we recognize that this is an individual that has a propensity, has not displayed any violence, but has a propensity. So we assign a CIT officer to that individual, and they go and they follow up and write a report and follow up with family, and also get ancillary assistance for them. So my utopia is to be able to put the entire police department through that 40-hour training. And I just had a meeting with one of our gurus who is just passionate about this. And he said, what if we compromise? So to your point about budget cuts, we can't afford to put everybody through the 40-hour training. I don't have the funds for that in my training. But what we can do is compromise and put people through an 8-hour training, because we don't necessarily need the 40-hour certification, but maybe a train-the-trainer. So that's exactly what we're looking at. And my goal is to have all patrol officers trained in CIT, because for me it's a force multiplier. Because in training, by the way, is we play like we practice. We play like we practice, and that's why we only had 4 instances last year of excessive force complaints against Aurora police officers. I mean, that's crazy good, and so I want to brag about that. But the reason I mention that is because this CIT training puts officers through de-escalation with mentally ill role players. I went to this class on that day, and they were role players acting as if, and going through all of these scenarios, and the officers had to respond. And I was sitting there watching this, and I thought, this isn't just good for for mental health. This is good for anyone a police officer comes in contact with. And when you can learn how to de-escalate, when you can find your center and take that rescue breathing 4 seconds and, you know, do what needs to be done, you're not going to act as quickly. So that's why I love it, because to me, it fits so many different scenarios.
Good. Let me just add to it. The Houston Police Department was our ending keynote, the ending presenter at the Illinois Pulmonary Policing Conference. Cops aren't oftentimes the best presenter. Kristen is, I'm not saying that. The presentation that went wasn't the best, right? And I'm going to tell you, well, on the side, the police officer that presented, who wasn't the best speaker, said in 30 seconds what I thought was just brilliant in terms of describing their initiative. And this really goes to the analytical side of handling mental illness. The CIT training that Kristen was talking about is the gold standard. I mean, it's 40 hours. My God, that's a lot of time that the officers go through this. So the reality that, you know, it'd be great if you could do it realistically. Let's see, right? Definitely there's a focus. You can imagine putting yourself in the shoes of a police officer where you go into a mental health problem, right? And the person is deranged and they're violent and they're doing all of these things. My God, what a horrific job that we give to them, right? And imagine yet that this person is a returning war veteran who's addicted and now has got firearms. And again, my God, you know, I certainly don't want to kill the individual as a police officer. I don't want to get killed, and I don't want them killing anybody else. Horrific situation. What Houston PD did in a very analytical way was determine who their chronic consumers were. Who were the people getting the most calls, right? And imagine being a family member, by the way, of one of these people suffering from mental illness, and every time there's a problem, you're dialing 911, and the police are coming, and they're like, so who is he? Well, he's armed, and he's off his meds, and oh my gosh, horrific type situations. Instead, what would happen with these chronic consumers is that there was individualized officers who would actually get cell phone calls. Instead of going through 911 dispatch, I would call Chief Zeman or Officer Zeman, and she already knew the family member, right? Oh, it's Fred again, let me talk to him. And when Kristen Zeman came and visited me and I'm deranged, oh, it's you again. How's it going? And we have a relationship and we have a rapport. And by the way, it's not just Officer Zeman that's showing up, it's a social worker and some other people that are much better trained in doing this for their livelihood, as opposed to the cop who's being put in this horrific situation of trying to de-escalate this. So we can, in a very collaborative way, become much more analytical at providing our resources in a much more directed way that makes a heck of a lot of sense for everybody. The officer that I mentioned that did the presentation had told me this. He was a big guy. Remember him? He's like, you know, he looked like he'd be a linebacker for the Bears. He said, within 22 years of doing the job, the last 2 have actually mattered. And that's when he was getting his cell phone calls from all of these people suffering from mental illness. Flipped open his phone and showed me 15 calls that as soon as he lands at the Houston airport, these were individuals that he'd be following up on and calling. So to me, that's really impactful and a different approach to the kind of job that we don't traditionally do. We should not oftentimes be putting the police in the positions that we do and trying to get them solve some of the most pressing social issues that we have in society. They certainly shouldn't be doing it alone. So, other questions? Yes.
I know you had your Aurora cadets go to like neutral ground to learn how to talk to a victim and do an interview, or at least like try to figure out what's going on. Do you have your police officers going through some sort of training for that?
Not specific. So here's what I learned, and this is just kind of anecdotal from my own observations over the years, is that you know, we can give training to officers, you know, that we don't get so much in the academy, but when cadets, yes, we send cadets over, and new recruits, you know, we try to expose them to victim-sensitive interviews and things like that. And what I found over the years is that there's a certain officers are much better at victim-sensitive interviews than others. And you know what was interesting? So I came on in 1994, and it was always, hey, can I get a female officer over here to talk to this domestic violence victim, or can I get a female officer over here to talk to this sexual assault victim? And so I was constantly going all over the place. And what I learned is that, you know, male officers are actually just as good at that. It just kind of depends on, it's an individual thing, I think is what I'm trying to say, is that yes, we don't specifically train on it, but in the course of the field training program, and then you know, and through their duties, the training kind of comes naturally. And what I've noticed is that some people are much better at it than others. I mean, there are still some police officers that find it very difficult to have these conversations, and you'll see the difference between that kind of person, just the facts, what happened, to someone who is compassionate and empathic, and we have a lot of those human beings as police officers. But to answer your question, no, we don't have specific training that deals precisely with that. Nothing outside of just maybe a small block in our field training.
Other questions?
Just wanted to clarify, I think you were saying, I love a lot of the emphases you're presenting here tonight, and I wanted to go back to one thing. I think you said when you were hiring a police officer, it's the case that there's really no interview. And that strikes me as hugely problematic, because even if I go apply to be like a server in a restaurant, I'm not getting hired to say, would you like a side order with that?
Right,
unless
exactly.
there's an interview.
Right.
But then you're placing people as law enforcement.
Oh, sure,
And
right.
you don't know if they can, if they're human beings.
Right, okay, and so let me back up just a little bit on that. So we have an officer that handles all the background checks, and it talks to all the officers, and there's that, gets to know that in that interaction, and through that background check, that officer is tasked with that, is, what kind of verbal skills. But again, it doesn't, we haven't done it as a command staff. And so it was kind of interesting is someone, it was actually during my chief's interview, I was like, who asked me this? The mayor asked me during my chief interview, there were 4 of us, and they said, let me ask you a question about recruitment and, bringing people into the police department. If you had a candidate that was very well educated, on that resume there was, Ivy League or what have you, and then you have another candidate that isn't quite as polished, which one would you hire? And I said, well, and this is sort of where the light bulb moment came, and I said, you're asking me, sometimes I think that we overlook the ideal candidate, by concentrating so much on a resume, and on degrees and things like that. And that's why I love that debate about college versus not. But to get to your point, and my answer was, what I would do is I would sit down and talk with them, and I would ask them questions, and I would find out how they communicate with me. And because I noticed that as we get through, I've been the field training, overseeing the field training program, and every month we get together and we talk about the recruits and what their progress is. And I get, now in the younger generation, I get this a lot from the field training officers. They just don't know how to talk to people. I mean, it's like they just want to text and, but they have a real hard time communicating with people on the street. And I'm like, how did they get here then? And so when that question came up, I kind of put 2 and 2 together, and I thought, this has to stop. I mean, that's great that our background check officer, but we need to put them in some scenarios before hiring, and as part of the interview process, so that we can see how you communicate, even just with me, with the boss. I'd like to bring you in and ask you some hard questions. So you're right, it's ludicrous. So I'm not saying no one ever has a conversation with them, but as far as a formal interview process, to put them through some scenario-based training. And so one of the things we just did, literally just signed the contract on this, is a new testing process where they're actually put through, it's a company that we've hired, we've outsourced, and they bring people in to test, and they're going through videos, and they're basically put in situations, and they'll have to talk. So that would be actually a part of the process. In the beginning, is to be problem solvers and to be able to talk to people, where before it was just a written test and then a psychological. So yeah, we have to get better. It just, even finding the well-rounded candidates, and my gosh, interview and conversation is probably the best place to start with that, in my humble opinion.
All right. Yeah.
Sorry, one more
That's all right.
question. During the whole initiative in Sheboygan with the neighborhood and the signs, did anyone follow the tag house to see if they went to a different neighborhood, continued selling?
There was some of that, and frankly, from the Sheboygan perspective, that oftentimes we would find that the dealer moved to Milwaukee or somebody else, and they said, fine, not of our neighborhood, that kind of thing. Frequently, these homes were being occupied by a boyfriend that wasn't on the lease. You got a single mom. Hey, he's paying the bills. all of a sudden there's pressure that says there's some problems here, and she's kicking him to the curb and he's moving somewhere else. And that's going to be difficult to track from just an analysis standpoint or from an assessment standpoint. Part of our assessment, which was unique, was to do pre and post interviews with everybody that was in the neighborhood. So we actually went door to door with a number of our criminal justice students measuring the perception of crime, police legitimacy type issues, and then we would go upwards of 2 years after the movement to determine as that perception changed. And what we found was very promising, that there was real significant changes in people's perceptions of crime. So again, what I've often tried to train police chiefs and officers and even students alike was, don't just focus in on the offenders, right? The offenders are only part of this. What you also need to look at is how that neighborhood respect level and perception of crime and issues are being held, because the offender could disappear, but that doesn't mean that the perception of crime has changed any. If you can measure that perceptions really change and police legitimacy type issues, respect for the police has changed, now you're doing something very promising. Okay, good question. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Hopefully you got some good ideas.